Democrat Robert Zimmerman and Republican George Santos are asking voters to put them in office in the 3rd Congressional District. The questions you want the candidates to answer in this Long Island Votes special presentation from the Newsday studios in Melville.
Welcome to the Newsday studios in Melville. I'm Associate Editor Joy Brown, and Newsday is hosting a series of political debates to make sure Long Islanders know where the candidates stand on key issues before Election Day. Our format will allow each candidate a minute for an opening and a minute for a closing statement. And on questions, the candidate getting the question will have 2 minutes to answer it, and the other candidate will have a minute rebuttal time. I'll be asking some questions submitted by Newsday's political team. Other questions will come from Long Islanders that we interviewed out in the streets, and some questions will come from social media. This debate is between candidates in the 3rd Congressional District. And this is kind of important because all the district lines change. So you probably want to know that this district includes communities in northern Nassau County, parts of Queens, and a stretch that goes all the way down into Massapequa. And with that, I would like to introduce our candidates. And you can clap, please. Robert Zimmerman and George Santos. I should tell you that before debate, we did a coin toss with a quarter, I believe it was, yes?
With a quarter.
To determine who would go first in their opening statements. And Mr. Zimmerman, you will go first.
By all means.
You have 1 minute.
Thank you, Joy, and certainly thank you, Newsday, for bringing us together at this historic time in our country, perhaps the most historic midterm election since the Civil War. Because this election for Congress is a test between the mainstream values that define my life and that I represent, and the values that George Santos represents from the extremist perspective. This is a very clear decision between the two of us as to where we stand and what we believe in for the future of our country. I'm for reproductive freedom. George Santos stands for a national ban for abortion with no exceptions, even for New Yorkers. I stand up for our police and standing up for public safety. George Santos actually defended the rioters on January 6th during the insurrection and even paid their legal fees and bragged about it, although 5 police officers were killed. I stand up strongly for rebuilding our communities, strengthening our networks, which is why I stand for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. George Santos opposed that. I look forward to your questions and discussions this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Mr. Santos, I screwed up, guys, on that coin toss. I hope it's not too awful for you. But Mr. Zimmerman, go ahead. 1 minute.
Well, Joy, thank you so much for having us here. This evening, you're going to see my opponent, Robert Zimmerman, make this debate about him and I. I want to make it about all of you in the room, because this race is not about the two of us. It's about you, the people of New York's 3rd District. He can say and mislead the audience and everybody watching at home to whatever he wants. At the end of the day, I stand proud in my record. This race is, for me, a personal race. It's the race to defend the American dream that my parents came to this country in search of, the American dream that I live today. The same American dream that I see vanishing right before our eyes for our children and our grandchildren. This country gave my family the opportunity to be great and survive. My opponent supports and will be a rubber stamp for everybody in Washington, D.C. who has started to bring down chaos upon the American people, from lawlessness, record inflation, and crime. So let's focus on you people and everybody in our district and the American people voting in NY's 3rd Congressional District tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. With that, let's go to our first question. This comes from Newsday's political team. And Mr. Zimmerman, this one comes to you. First, the House in July voted to codify same-sex marriage after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. This issue is likely to come up again. How would you vote and why?
Well, certainly I'm going to be voting to defend same-sex marriage and vote to codify it. And that's certainly an essential vote I'm taking, not just as a gay man, but I'm taking that vote because it's the right vote to take for the future of our nation. It's the right vote to take out of respect for the decency and honor of respecting people's lives and their freedom to love. But the issue here before us is not the issue of just same-sex marriage. It's the issue of standing up for the rights of the LGBTQ plus community. Both George Santos and I are gay, but that's not the point. The point is who's going to be out there and be a leader and defending the rights of the community. That's the point. I proudly stand as someone who's been a leader and an advocate of defending the freedoms and opportunities for the LGBTQ plus community, their right to adopt, the right to love who they choose, the right to have the families, free from job discrimination. Regrettably, George Santos actually defends the Don't Say Gay legislation, uses language such as grooming, the most hateful, divisive language against the gay community. He's actually stood with people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, the QAnon congresswoman. He describes as a personal friend. And with Matt Gaetz, Congressman Matt Gaetz, an individual he just announced his endorsement of George. The reality is standing up for the LGBTQ plus community means standing up for their rights and standing up against homophobia and the fear that it creates. Regrettably, George embraces the type of divisive individuals, the type of bigots against the gay community. He calls them his personal friends. He stands with them in their legislation against us. I'll stand just the opposite way. I'm committed because I understand what it is growing up as an isolated, gay kid in the 70s, the isolation and loneliness that confronted so many members of the gay community. I'm not going to allow a new generation of LGBTQ youth be forced back in the closet through Don't Say Gay legislation. I'm not going to allow them to be penalized or feel discriminated against. It's one of my missions running for office, standing up for the civil rights and social justice of them and so many others.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Mr. Santos, you have 1 minute, rebuttal.
Well, my opponent can stand here all night and mislead this audience into distracting you from the real issues at hand and not addressing the issues of crime, not addressing the issues of inflation, and not addressing the issues that really keep each and every one of us up at night thinking, can we afford the roof over our head? Can we feed our children? Is it safe to go to work and go into a public transportation? So I want to make clear that I'm not going to spend time setting the record with my opponent. I'm not going to waste your time, and I'm not going to distract you from the issues at hand that really matter to the people. And I'd love to get this debate to go back to the people and give them really what they deserve, which is discussions on the issues.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. This is question number 2, and you're coming to you first for 2 minutes. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina has introduced legislation that would ban abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy nationwide. The issue of a federal ban on abortion is likely to come up again. How would you vote on this issue and why?
Well, earlier this year, the Supreme Court gave the power back to the states through the 10th Amendment, giving New Yorkers the peace of mind that nothing changes in the state of New York. So there's nothing at the federal level, nor would I make it a priority to use my time in federal government to debate an issue that has now been deferred and set back to the states, where people have more control over these decisions. Your voice is heard better. You have more control over your elected laws and your state laws. So I will not allocate any time while in Congress to debate an issue that is no longer important in Congress. It is more important for the people to decide in their local states and make sure that they remember that in the state of New York, nothing has changed for every single person.
Mr. Zimmerman, you have 1 minute rebuttal.
Let's be very clear, George. When you say you won't give it any time, it doesn't mean how you're going to vote. You have publicly said you support a national ban on abortion with no exceptions, even for New Yorkers. That is not a distraction. That is not an issue that is one that you should just easily dismiss. In fact, you've even gone so far as saying you're going to criminalize doctors who participate in abortion services. You've even gone farther than that. You have mocked women who feel who have been the victims of rape. You've said that they would be using rape as an excuse to get an abortion. And when you finally said that that could be considered as an exception, you said they had to get a police documentation to do it. Let's be very clear where you stand. Your approach to this issue will not only jeopardize women's lives, women will die because of your position trying to have a national ban on abortion. And in the same way, when you say that the rights of the LGBTQ plus community is a distraction, let's also remember, George, standing up for the rights of our LGBTQ plus community, standing up for the young people who are facing intimidation and threats and harassment is not a distraction. It's our moral obligation.
Let us go out and talk to some Long Islanders. Let's go to Glen Cove.
I would like to know which candidate is going to lower my taxes.
This is Janine and the eternal Long Island lament about taxes. What are you going to do? Mr. Zimmerman, you go first. You have 2 minutes.
You know, Janine, thank you for that question. And it's an issue I can certainly relate to. This is not, people treat this like it's a Washington debate or a Washington or a political theory. This is an issue I live with every day as a small business owner. I've been a small business owner for 33 years. I understand what inflation means. I understand what the tax burdens mean. I understand what it means for all of our homeowners, for our residents, for our seniors, for our young people trying to start families. So let me be very clear with you, Janine, where I stand. One of my first priorities is going to be to build bipartisan coalitions to restore the state and local tax deduction. That's an imperative. George Santos, when the bill was first introduced, refused to oppose it. Later on, he came around to finally agreeing with us with the help of public pressure. That's going to be imperative. I'm going to support a gas tax holiday to try to give us some relief from the economic burdens we're facing in this very difficult time. I'm going to stand up demanding a strong living wage and stand up for labor unions, which would provide the gateway to the middle class for so many people. And we also have to find ways to bring costs down. That's why I support the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which George Santos has opposed, because that legislation is so important for reinvesting in New York, creating jobs, fixing our roads, protecting our water supply, protecting the Long Island Sound. That's why I stand up in support of Social Security, because even though George wants to privatize Social Security, that would end Social Security as we know it. We also have to bring down the cost of prescription drugs. I proudly supported the legislation that was passed that would put a cap on senior citizen medication up to $2,000 cap and would for the first time lower the price of prescription drugs by having Medicare negotiate. We should be expanding that bill. Unfortunately, George Santos opposed even that bill to lower the cost of prescription drugs and to put caps on prescription drugs for our senior citizens. There are many steps we can take. It takes leadership. It takes a commitment to work across the aisle to do it. That defines my life. And that's what I'm going to be, it's my pledge to you, not just as a Long Island business owner, but as a member of Congress to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Mr. Santos, you have 1 minute. And I remind the audience to keep the applause to the end, please.
Joy, as I said earlier, my opponent's going to say a lot of things that are misleading, that he cannot corroborate. I have no record. I've never held elected office. So again, I have never put out an opinion where I would have to defend out here, or have I ever voted on a bill that I would have to defend. So he keeps referencing and putting words in my mouth that are just mistruths and essentially misleading to the American people. What I want to say to everybody in this room is be very clear that it is the Democrat Party that controls all of New York State government. It is the Democrat Party who controls all of Washington, D.C. I'd like to see him tell our constituent, Janine, who just asked the question of taxes, why is it that under one-party rule, both in Washington, D.C. and in the state of New York, taxes are backbreaking and they're costing every American on Long Island record costs of living? It's not my party. This isn't about parties. This is about the people. Answer them that. That's the real answer.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. And let's go to Twitter for a second here. This is from Michael Reichert. And Mr. Santos, this comes to you for 2 minutes. How will you bring federal dollars into disadvantaged areas of your district to provide jobs and an economic anchor?
That's a great question, Joy. So a big issue that we suffer on Long Island is infrastructure. It's in decay. Our electrical grid is embarrassing, to say the least. We're amongst the highest taxed areas in the country, yet if we get a storm, we lose power. Most people are forced to have a backup generator, but not everybody can afford one. So the reality is, with the outpour of tax dollars that goes out of New York and Long Island and in the 3rd Congressional District, we need to focus on bringing real infrastructure jobs into the district by allocating federal dollars to upgrade the electrical grid, by allocating federal dollars to upgrade our roads, to upgrade infrastructure as a whole, including revitalizing our Long Island Sound. So in reality is Democrats pay a lot of lip service. They give you a lot of promises, but they deliver nothing. They've had control of federal government for the last 21 months, and we are yet to see any real results coming out of Washington, D.C., other than backbreaking inflation, skyrocketing crime, and as PSEGLI put forward, that the cost of energy to heat your home will be 3 times more expensive this winter. What are the Democrats doing about that in leadership? Absolutely nothing. So the reality is we need to be truthful to ourselves and look at who's in charge and what's happening. Robert Zimmerman, my opponent, is going to be nothing more than a rubber stamp for that same agenda, prolonging the suffering of the American people for another 2 years.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. I'm going to remind you guys again, please wait till the end here. But we're going to go over to you, to Mr. Zimmerman. You have 1 minute for rebuttal.
Sure. First of all, George, so there's no confusion for either you or the audience, everything I said is well documented on the public record. You were a candidate for Congress 2 years, where you issued many of these policy positions I'm now quoting. And during the course of this campaign, you've done the same thing. So it's all well documented, and you certainly well know that. The bigger point here is that when you talk about getting results, I think it's very much to the credit of Congress working in a bipartisan way that we got the first bipartisan infrastructure bill passed in over 50 years. The greatest investment in rebuilding our infrastructure here on Long Island and in our nation. And frankly, George, it's regrettable that you couldn't even overcome your partisanship to stand with that bipartisan bill, which is so essential for creating jobs, so essential for protecting our water quality, so essential for protecting the Long Island Sound, and in terms of making sure that we can retrofit our sewage treatment plants to stop the seepage into the Sound and nitrogen going into the region. So there are many important steps that have been taken, and unfortunately, George, while people have worked in a bipartisan way, you refuse to do so.
Mr. Zimmerman, you'll have 2 minutes for this one, and this one is from Newsday's political team. President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan will cancel up to $10,000 in federal student loan debt for individuals who earn less than $125,000 a year, or married couples making less than $250,000 a year. The Congressional Budget Office says the program will cost $400 billion over the next 30 years and add to the federal budget deficit. What is your position on student loan forgiveness and how the government will cover the cost?
You know, this is one of the great issues that highlights the hypocrisy of the right wing and mainstream thinking. Let me be very clear. I support the student loan forgiveness program. It's worth noting that when the Trump tax cut bill was put through, they gave record giveaways to the top earners in our country and the top corporations in our country. The Republican leadership and Donald Trump said, don't worry, it's going to pay for itself. Well, it produced a deficit of between $1.5 trillion and $2 trillion. You don't hear the Republicans talking about deficit spending then, but when you start giving kids getting student loans at $10,000 break, that becomes a national scandal. The reality is 90% of the young people who are going to benefit from these student loans are at the lower level of the economic spectrum. And they're in debt because the student loan program is so rigged that they can never get out of paying student loans. They can never get out of debt. So this gives them some relief so they can rebuild their lives, finish their education, maybe buy a home, start a family. It's an investment in our economy, and that's an important step that should be taken. So yes, I think the student loan forgiveness is an essential first step as an economic generator and to help students escape the predatory lending of the student loan program. Let me also point out that more has to be done. That's not the answer by itself. We have to make sure that, in fact, we can deal with the issue of predatory lending and put that to an end. We've got to have free community colleges and free trade schools to give young people an opportunity to get involved in the workforce. And we also have to make sure that as we go forward, we're always going to be very mindful of how we're going to best encourage building a stronger economic market for our young people. I think this is going to be very critical, and we have to also address the cost of college. That is crucial. I mean, tuition hikes are going up astronomically. That's why so many students get stuck in a spiral of student loan debt. So I would tie college tuition, private colleges, and tuition hikes to the federal and state loans and grants they get, so we make sure it never is higher than the rate of inflation.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Mr. Santos, you have 1 minute, rebuttal.
I think myself and the American people sit at home wondering, who's going to pay for all of that? How are you going to address the record inflation that we're living under, the increasing deficit that just doesn't stop growing, and now we're going to add more money to that deficit? I'm not against education. I'm very pro-education. Education's a springboard out of poverty. It worked for my family. It works for many families across this country. But the reality is forgiving student loan debt, and how about all the Americans who didn't take that debt, decided not to go to college because they couldn't afford it. And now they're going to be stuck with the bill for people who made a cognizant choice during a time where we can't afford it. That's just unrealistic, it's irresponsible, and it's exactly what my opponent supports. adding more dollars to the deficit, adding more percentages of inflation, and rising the percentage of inflation in our country that's already in a record high. So,
thank you, Mr. Santos. Let's go back out and hear from Long Islander.
Yes, how you doing? My name's Kevin Slaughter. I was wondering if you guys would be able to figure out if you do anything with affordable housing.
Affordable housing, inflation. Mr. Santos, what would you talk to Kevin about on this?
I think affordable housing is a problem in our country. We need to address it. I talk a lot about this, especially when we're referencing developments such as NYCHA in New York City. You can go into these public housings and subhuman conditions that are being offered to people. That's just not correct. We need to make sure that we're not only updating facilities and we're giving people lifelines, but we're treating them with respect. We're making sure that we're making affordable housing accessible to everybody. And that's an issue that we need to come together to understand, that we need to put first our American people and making sure that we take care of our own before we start extending help to millions of people trying to pour into our country. We need to make sure that they come first. It's people like Kevin. They deserve to be first in line before we extend help and aid to the rest of the country, rest of the world. So that's where my stand is. And my opponent, unfortunately, he's another rubber stamp for keeping the borders open and allowing more people to come in here, exacerbating the affordability in the market for public housing. So this is just another stark difference between him and I and how we want to address the issue.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. Mr. Zimmerman, you have 1 minute.
How you went from affordable housing to talk about border security is quite a leap and a pretty desperate try. I have to tell you, I have a proud, strong record of border security, which I'm glad to discuss. But the bigger point here in addressing Kevin's question is that we have to have a commitment to workforce housing. It's essential for so many of our communities on Long Island. It means we bring young people back here to Long Island to work. It's important to make sure that our villages and our local downtowns are revitalized. It's really, and it's an issue that, it's funny how the world has changed. Everywhere I go throughout Nassau County and Queens, there's a recognition of the need to bring back what they call workforce housing or affordable housing, so young people can live at home, live where they grew up, contribute to their communities, get jobs locally, be near their families. So yes, I think it's something that has to be pursued. The federal government has a unique opportunity to play a role in terms of incentivizing workforce housing or affordable housing to be constructed. They can play an important role in doing that. In addition to which, we have through infrastructure unique opportunities to improve the housing market.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman.
So I look forward to working on that. Thank you.
You get 2 minutes on this one.
Okay.
In June, President Biden signed legislation to expand background checks for gun buyers under the age of 21 and to earmark millions of dollars for states to fund intervention programs such as drug courts and to carry out red flag laws that allow authorities to temporarily confiscate guns from people found by judges to be too dangerous to possess them. Again, another issue that could be coming up. How would you vote on the issue and why?
I would certainly vote for it. In fact, I consider this issue the moral test of our nation, standing up for strong, sound gun safety legislation. You know, as I go door to door throughout our congressional district, I get the same comment from virtually every home I visit, every young family, that their children have to do more shooter drills than they have to do fire drills in school. No family should ever have to deal with that trauma of worrying when their child goes to school whether they're going to come home safely. No family should have to worry about going to the supermarket whether they're going to be a victim of assault weapons or gun violence. I've been endorsed by former Congresswoman Carolyn McCarthy and by Linda Beagle-Schulman because of my leadership on this issue. So yes, I want to see red flag laws in place. I want to see us get ghost guns out of existence. Those are the guns that people manufacture. I'm for an assault weapons ban. I stand very strongly for limiting the number of magazines in a bullet, number of bullets in a magazine, and certainly stand very strongly for stronger background checks. It's essential. And once again, this is another example. We had bipartisan legislation to get this done finally. It was a very important first step. But regrettably, my opponent, George Santos, has said publicly he doesn't think that we need any more gun laws. He said that several times. He also said that really the problem is people coming from godless homes and people coming from weak families. Well, you know, I believe as President Kennedy said, in this life, God's work must truly be our own. So I'm going to Congress with a commitment, because it's a moral imperative, to put in strong, safe gun safety legislation including mental health counseling, to begin to move us out of this tragic pandemic of gun violence that's afflicted our nation.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Mr. Santos, you have 1 minute.
My opponent likes to continue to put words in my mouth, so and make this about us. I'm yet to see how we're talking about the audience or people watching at home. So being very brief on the topic, as he referenced, we have several hundred gun laws in our country, and yet we create more gun laws, and as he said, gun violence doesn't stop. Every time we create a gun law to take away a legal weapon from a law-abiding citizen, not from a criminal. Criminals don't follow our laws. But my opponent likes to support, desperately and financially, politicians who have created terrible, terrible laws in the state of New York, who have put us all in danger, such as Todd Kaminsky. He wanted him to become DA, top cop for Nassau County just last year, after he created and authored the most disastrous bail reforms in the state's history. The hypocrisy is just far too much, Mr. Zimmerman.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. Mr. Santos, you have 2 minutes on this one. The recent stabbing death of a uniformed paramedic and longtime EMT from Huntington has once again raised the issue of violent crime. What can be done on a federal level to address concerns about violent crime?
Allison Russo lost her life on duty, and I think everybody in this room should know her name and should keep her in your prayers. It is bad policy that took away Allison Russo's life, where we have people at large in the city, on the island. It's spilling into the island whether you like it or not. The North Shore has become a target for all of the crime that's coming in from the city of New York. In Congress, what we should do, and we have the moral obligation to do, is to secure federal dollars to fund and well-fund our law enforcement officers to make sure that they're well-equipped, prepared to fend off violent criminals. That we understand that incarceration is not because we're a bad society, it's because it's necessary. Certain people need to be incarcerated and corrected for their actions. The problem is that the Democrats like to coddle criminals, and they like to pass laws that coddle criminals and put them back in the streets. So again, going back to my opponent, who would support Nancy Pelosi's agenda like a rubber stamp, who would support Joe Biden's agenda like a rubber stamp, and in fact was campaigning with the Governor Kathy Hochul just yesterday. The reality and the facts are clear. He supports politicians who have made us all in this room less safe. He supports an agenda that will keep Americans less safe. He supports the same agenda and politicians that have made New York less safe. Mayor Adams recently said, New York has a brand. I hope he wasn't referencing the brand of crime, because I don't recognize that brand, Joy.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. Mr. Zimmerman, you have 1 minute rebuttal.
Allison Russo's tragic death diminishes all of us. She truly lived her life and was a true American hero. Her family, her friends, her loved ones, and the Fire Department of New York should all be in our prayers and in our hearts, because that loss truly, truly diminishes everything we dream of, every hope we have for our city and for our safety. But I think it's important not to politicize that tragic loss. I think it's important to realize, when we talk about standing up to crime, one of the reasons I've been endorsed by former New York City Police Commissioner Bill Bratton is because I've been a very outspoken and consistent advocate of making fixes in the bail reform laws, giving judges greater discretion so they can review a defendant's past, making sure that we have not just appearance tickets for hate crimes, but actual tickets, actual penalties, and full enforcement of the law for hate crimes.
This one will come to you for 2 minutes. Sure. In the wake of continued debate about voting and the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, there's a bipartisan move to overhaul the way Congress certifies the results of future elections. How would you vote on an overhaul proposal?
First of all, if you're referring to the Electoral Count Act, that legislation, I would support it. But let me make it very clear, there is no continuing debate going on in our country. Joe Biden won in a free and fair election. Donald Trump's top advisors, his election security analyst, his attorney general, his FBI director, all said it was a free and fair election, and there was no level of corruption that could have overturned it. Regrettably, my opponent, George Santos, repeated Donald Trump's lies about the election, even claimed when he lost by 30% to Tom Suozzi for Congress, he was also the victim of election fraud. Let's understand how dangerous and damaging that is when we try to attack our democracy, undermine free and fair elections just for political gain. We saw the results on January 6th, an insurrection where insurrectionists raided the Capitol, building a gallows to hang Mike Pence, hunting down members of Congress in the halls of the Congress to either murder or kidnap those who they disagreed with. And George Santos tragically was there, regrettably, inexcusably was there. He was at the ellipse with President Trump. He defended Donald Trump's speech at that day, even when Republican leaders denounced it for inciting violence. He actually literally bragged about paying the legal fees for the insurrectionists, those people who raided the Capitol, rioted there, and the violence was so severe that over five police officers were killed and over 100 police officers were injured, many of them very seriously. George, you can't talk about public safety with any degree of credibility. You can't talk about standing up for law enforcement with any honor or sincerity when you defend rioters and insurrectionists who murder and maim police officers, when you support people who want to overturn our Constitution and you want to bring down our democracy. There are issues that are bigger than politics. Our Constitution is one of those issues, George.
Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman. Mr. Santos, you have a minute rebuttal?
The same Constitution that the Democrat Party has been trampling on for the last 21 months is the Constitution you mentioned, Rob. It's pretty impressive. But I do want to ask and remind everybody, it was until 2016 my opponent was opposing the 2000 elections, claiming that Al Gore won the 2000 contest. It's in video, it's documented very well. So I find the hypocrisy coming from my opponent to be astounding this evening. Again, a lot with the misleading things he keeps saying about me that I did or did not do, or the locations I've been or I've been not. So I just want the American people watching at home to understand that he's making this about him. I'm making this about you. I want to work with you. I want to work with each and every one of you in the 3rd Congressional District to make sure we deliver results that are tangible, those same issues that keep us all up at night thinking. Our mortgage payments, rent, the cost of gas, the cost of transportation, the risk of commuting into work.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. We will move now to closing statements. I believe, Mr. Zimmerman, you go first, and Mr. Santos, you go second. That is correct, based on how we started?
That works for me. That's just fine. Thank you,
Mr.
Joy. First
Santos,
of all,
1 minute. I'm sorry, Mr. Zimmerman,
okay.
1 minute.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you, Newsday, for bringing us together on such an important time. And I think the discussion you heard tonight illustrates why this conversation is so important. I've spoken to you as a mainstream Democrat, one who's prepared to work across the aisle. Peter King gave me great credit for working with him to pass the 9/11 Zoroga relief bill. I was given great credit by local Republicans for working with them during the pandemic. Because I know that if we're going to deliver for our communities in this congressional district, we have to be able to reach across the aisle. George Santos can't point to one Democrat who will ever acknowledge he made any effort to work in a bipartisan way. This election is about whether we stand up for the values that define the future of our country. When I speak about standing up for reproductive freedom for women, I'm speaking about constitutional privacy and safety that everyone's entitled to. When I speak up against the insurrectionist movement that George Santos defends, I'm standing up for our Constitution and our democracy. When I speak to these issues, when I speak about building a stronger middle class, I'm speaking of the future of Long Island and Queens and our congressional district.
Thank you, Mr.
so
Zimmerman.
much.
Mr. Santos, again, hold applause, please. Mr. Santos?
Joy, thank you very much for having us. This is a very important discussion in the time we're living. I renew my pledge to fight for the American dream. I renew my pledge to be your partner in government, to work with you all watching at home, to deliver results, to make sure and assure that your children have a future in our country, that our country comes back from this dark time that we're living, that it is safe to go back out into the streets, that it is safe to count on your salary covering your overhead, that it is safe to understand that you will have people in government who will defend your well-being, your livelihood, your bottom line. This race is all about the control of Congress and who it lies with for the next 2 years. You can give Joe Biden a rubber stamp for another 2 years and send my opponent to Congress, or you can give me somebody who will stand up to Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi at every opportunity and deliver results for the 3rd Congressional District of New York. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Santos. Now you can applaud. There you go.
Thank you, Rob.
I want to say thank you to Mr. Zimmerman. Thank you to Mr. Santos. Thank you to our studio audience here. And I also want to say thank you to Long Island. You guys gave us some good questions. We're looking for more. We do have 3 other debates coming along. I would remind you that you should continue to follow our political coverage at newsday.com, at Newsday TV, and look forward, please, to our Voter's Guide. And with that, thank you all again, and have a good evening and good night.